My name is Sarah, and I'm 34 years old. For 8 years, I've been married to Michael, a software engineer who once made me laugh until my sides hurt. Now, standing in our bathroom at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night, staring at my reflection in the mirror, I can barely recognize the woman looking back at me. "You're being dramatic again, Sarah." Michael's voice still echoes from our bedroom, where he's probably already scrolling through his phone, dismissing our entire conversation like it never happened. I'd been discussing how overwhelmed I felt managing our household while working full-time as a marketing coordinator. He'd been playing some mobile game, occasionally grunting responses. When I asked him to look at me while I spoke, he sighed heavily and said those words that would change everything. "Here we go again with the drama. This is exactly why I don't take you seriously, Sarah. You turn everything into some big emotional production." That's when something inside me died. Not broke, died. There's a difference between breaking and dying. Breaking implies it can be fixed, mended, glued back together. But when something dies, it's gone forever, leaving only space where it used to be. I'd spent years believing his narrative. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I did overreact to things. Maybe wanting emotional connection from my husband was asking too much. Maybe expressing hurt when he forgot our anniversary for the 3rd year running was, indeed, dramatic. The woman in the mirror has dark circles under her eyes from staying up late finishing the laundry he promised to help with. Her shoulders slump from carrying invisible weight, the mental load of remembering everything, planning everything, worrying about everything. Her lips are pressed thin from biting back words, swallowing feelings, shrinking herself to fit into his definition of reasonable. But tonight, looking at this exhausted stranger wearing my face, I realize something profound. I'm not dramatic. I'm human. And humans have feelings. Humans need connection. Humans deserve to be heard without being labeled or dismissed. I think about our early dating days when Michael would call me passionate, not dramatic. When my enthusiasm about life was charming, not excessive. When my emotional intelligence was something he admired, not something he tolerated. Somewhere along the way, my strengths became character flaws in his eyes. The house is quiet now, except for the hum of the dishwasher I loaded alone, again. Our 8-year-old daughter Emma is asleep, unaware that mommy just had her last fight with daddy. Not because we'll never disagree again, but because I'll never again subject myself to the humiliation of having my feelings dismissed as theater. I wash my face with cold water, each splash like a baptism into a new version of myself. The old Sarah died tonight in that bedroom, killed by years of being told her emotions were inconvenient, her needs were excessive, her pain was performance. But death isn't always an ending. Sometimes it's a beginning. I dry my face and look one more time at my reflection. The woman looking back has made a decision that will change everything. She won't argue anymore. She won't explain anymore. She won't fight for understanding anymore. She won't give him the satisfaction of calling her dramatic ever again. Because you can't be dramatic if you don't speak. The decision settles over me like armor. I'm done performing the role of the understanding wife who apologizes for having feelings. I'm done shrinking myself to make him comfortable. I'm done being the emotional caretaker of a man who sees my humanity as hysteria. Tomorrow, I'll wake up as a different woman. Not bitter, not angry, just quiet, strategic, observant. I'll become someone who watches instead of engages, who notes instead of reacts, who protects instead of pleads. Michael thinks he's won tonight. He believes he's finally trained me out of my dramatic tendencies, but he has no idea what he's actually done. He's freed me from the exhausting burden of trying to make him understand something he refuses to see. As I turn off the bathroom light and head to bed, I feel something I haven't experienced in years. Peace. Not the peace of resolution, but the peace of surrender. I'm surrendering the fight for his emotional availability, his respect, his partnership. I'm keeping my energy for myself now. I met Michael at a company mixer 5 years after college. I was 26, confident in my career, surrounded by good friends, and genuinely happy with my life. I wasn't looking for someone to complete me. I was already complete. I was looking for someone to compliment me. Michael was charming in that effortless way some men possess. He had an easy smile, quick wit, and the kind of presence that made you feel like you were the only person in the room when he focused on you. During our first conversation, I mentioned feeling frustrated about a project at work, and he listened intently, asked thoughtful questions, and offered genuine perspective. "I love how passionate you are about everything," he said, as we stood on the restaurant balcony later that evening. "Most people just coast through life, but you really care about things. It's refreshing. Passionate, not dramatic. Refreshing, not exhausting. Our early relationship felt like a partnership. When I got excited about a new marketing campaign I was developing, he'd listen to my ideas and offer insights from his tech perspective. When I worried about my sister going through her divorce, he'd hold me while I cried and help me brainstorm ways to support her. My emotional nature wasn't a flaw to be managed. It was a feature he genuinely appreciated. The shift happened gradually, so slowly I didn't notice until it was too late. Like how you don't realize you're gaining weight until your clothes don't fit anymore. One day, passionate became intense. Caring became overwhelming. Expressing concern became creating problems. The first time he called me dramatic, we'd been married for 6 months. His mother had made a comment about my cooking at Sunday dinner, something about how some people didn't know how to properly season meat. I'd felt hurt and embarrassed, especially since I'd spent hours preparing the meal specifically for her. When I mentioned it to Michael later, he sighed and said, "She was probably just trying to help. You're being a little dramatic about it." I remember feeling confused rather than angry. Dramatic? I'd simply expressed that my feelings were hurt, but I trusted his perspective more than my own at that point. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I needed to develop thicker skin. Maybe being a good wife meant not taking things personally. The words started appearing more frequently. When I cried during a movie, "It's just a film, don't be so dramatic." When I got upset that he'd made plans without consulting me, "You're being dramatic about a simple scheduling mix-up." When I worried about our finances, "Stop being so dramatic about money." Each time he used that word, it chipped away at my confidence in my own emotional responses. I began second-guessing myself constantly. Was I overreacting? Was I too sensitive? Were my feelings valid, or was I just being dramatic? I started apologizing for having emotions. "Sorry, I know I'm being dramatic, but," became a frequent preface to any expression of discontent. I was essentially asking permission to feel and seeking his approval for the validity of my emotional experience. The most insidious part was how he'd frame it as concern for my well-being. "I'm worried about you, Sarah. You get so worked up over little things. It's not healthy to be so dramatic about everything." He positioned himself as the rational, level-headed partner trying to help his overly emotional wife achieve balance. I began monitoring my reactions, editing my responses, shrinking my emotional footprint to avoid the label. If something upset me, I'd ask myself, is this worth being called dramatic over? Usually the answer was no. It was easier to swallow the hurt than endure the dismissal. Friends started commenting on how calm I'd become. "Marriage has really mellowed you out," they'd say, not realizing that my calmness wasn't growth, it was suppression. I wasn't more mature, I was more afraid. Afraid of being too much, feeling too much, needing too much. By our 3rd anniversary, I'd become a master at emotional regulation. I could receive hurtful news with a smile, handle disappointment with grace, and navigate conflict without raising my voice. Michael was proud of how reasonable I'd become. He'd tell people, "Sarah used to be pretty dramatic, but she's learned to keep things in perspective." What he didn't realize was that I hadn't learned perspective. I'd learned performance. I was performing the role of the easygoing wife, while my authentic self slowly suffocated under the weight of constant self-censorship. Looking back now, I can see how methodically he rewrote our history. The passionate woman he'd fallen in love with became the dramatic woman he needed to fix. My emotional intelligence became emotional instability. My depth became drama. And I let him do it because I trusted his version of reality more than my own. If I were to document every time Michael called me dramatic, I'd need a filing cabinet. But some instances burned themselves into my memory with the clarity of trauma, becoming reference points for how small I was willing to make myself. There was my 30th birthday. I'd mentioned weeks beforehand that I wanted to celebrate, maybe have dinner at that Italian restaurant downtown where we'd had our first official date. Nothing extravagant, just acknowledgement that I was entering a new decade. The day came and went without mention. When I brought it up that evening, hurt evident in my voice, Michael looked genuinely surprised. "Was that today? God, Sarah, you should have reminded me. You know how busy work has been." When I started crying, not sobbing, just quiet tears of disappointment, he shook his head. "Come on, don't be so dramatic. It's just a birthday. We can go to dinner this weekend." We never did go to dinner that weekend. The forgotten anniversary was worse because it represented a pattern. Year after year, I'd hope he'd remember the date that was supposedly meaningful to both of us. Year after year, I'd drop hints that became increasingly obvious. Year after year, the date would pass unmarked while I pretended it didn't matter. The 3rd time it happened, I finally said something. "Michael, you forgot our anniversary again." He was scrolling through ESPN on his laptop, not even looking up. Did I? "What's the date today?" When I told him, he shrugged. "Oh, right. October 15th. Sorry, babe. You know dates aren't my thing." "But it's our anniversary," I said, my voice smaller than I intended. "It matters to me." That's when he finally looked up, irritation flashing across his face. "Sarah, we're married. We live together. Every day is our anniversary, isn't it? Why do you need some arbitrary date to feel special? You're being dramatic about calendar squares." Calendar squares. He reduced our wedding anniversary to calendar squares. The household responsibilities battle was an ongoing war where I consistently lost. I worked 40 hours a week just like he did, but somehow I was responsible for everything domestic. Groceries, cooking, cleaning, laundry, scheduling Emma's activities, managing her school communications, remembering family birthdays, organizing social plans, maintaining our calendar, paying bills. When I finally broke down one evening, exhausted from working all day, then coming home to cook dinner while he played video games, he listened to my complaints with the patience of someone humoring a child. "You're being dramatic, Sarah. I help plenty. Just last week I loaded the dishwasher without you asking. Once." He'd loaded the dishwasher once, and he referenced it like it was evidence of equal partnership. "I'm drowning, Michael," I told him. "I feel like I'm managing everything alone." "That's not true," he replied calmly. "You just like controlling everything. If you wanted help, you should ask for it instead of being dramatic about doing everything yourself." The cruelest part was how he made my exhaustion my fault. I wasn't overworked. I was controlling. I wasn't overwhelmed. I was dramatic. I wasn't asking for partnership. I was creating problems. When my father had his heart attack, I was devastated. Dad was only 58, healthy as far as we knew, and suddenly he was in cardiac intensive care. I spent 3 days at the hospital, alternating between his bedside and phone calls with insurance companies, doctors, and family members. Michael visited once, stayed for an hour, and left because he found hospitals depressing. When I came home on the third night, emotionally drained and terrified about my father's prognosis, I found Michael exactly where I'd left him, on the couch with takeout containers and his laptop. The house was a disaster. Emma had been staying with my sister because I couldn't manage everything. "How's your dad?" he asked without looking up from his screen. "Stable, but it was touch and go for a while," I said, collapsing next to him. "I was so scared, Michael. I really needed you there with me." He finally looked at me, and I saw impatience rather than compassion. "Sarah, you know I can't handle medical stuff. I went once, didn't I? Besides, your sister was there, and your mom flew in. You had plenty of support. You're being dramatic about needing me specifically." I stared at him, speechless. My father had nearly died. I'd spent 3 days in crisis mode, and my husband's response was that I was being dramatic for wanting his support. That was the moment I realized he wasn't just dismissing my feelings. He was erasing them entirely. In his world, any emotion that inconvenienced him was automatically classified as drama. Any need that required his effort was unreasonable. Any pain that didn't directly affect him was performance. I stopped crying that night. Not because I felt better, but because I finally understood that my tears meant nothing to him, except noise to be silenced. After years of being labeled dramatic for expressing normal human emotions, I decided to become the wife Michael apparently wanted. One who never complained, never needed reassurance, never inconvenienced him with feelings. If he wanted someone who didn't create waves, I'd become perfectly still water. The transformation required enormous effort. Every natural impulse to share excitement, disappointment, worry, or joy had to be filtered through one question. Will this make him call me dramatic? Usually the answer was yes, so I learned to swallow it all. When my best friend Jennifer got engaged and asked me to be her maid of honor, my first instinct was to call Michael and share the exciting news. Then I remembered his typical response to my enthusiasm about other people's milestones. "Why are you so worked up about someone else's wedding?" Or, "You're being dramatic about a party that has nothing to do with us." So instead, I mentioned it casually during dinner, presenting the news like a weather report rather than a celebration. "That's nice," he said, not looking up from his plate. No follow-up questions about the wedding plans. No acknowledgement of what it meant that my closest friend had chosen me for such an important role. His disinterest used to hurt. Now I simply accepted it as baseline. I became an expert at emotional self-regulation. When Emma's teacher called to say she'd been acting out at school, potentially indicating stress at home, I handled the entire situation alone. I scheduled meetings with the counselor, researched child psychology articles, and implemented behavior strategies without mentioning any of it to Michael. When he eventually asked why I'd been leaving work early for appointments, I explained about Emma's situation. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. seeming almost offended that I'd excluded him. Because every time I've brought up concerns about Emma, you've told me I'm being dramatic about normal childhood phases. I replied evenly. I didn't want to stress you out with something I could handle myself. He couldn't argue with that logic because it was based entirely on his own previous responses. I'd learned to anticipate his dismissal and circumvent it by simply not including him in the emotional labor of parenting. The holidays became particularly challenging. I'd always loved Christmas, threw myself into decorating, gift-giving, and creating special traditions for Emma. But my enthusiasm had been repeatedly labeled as going overboard and being dramatic about holidays. So I scaled back. Way back. That December, I bought minimal decorations, made a simple dinner instead of the elaborate feast I usually prepared, and purchased practical gifts rather than the thoughtful, personal ones I used to spend weeks selecting. When Emma asked why Christmas felt different, I told her we were simplifying things this year. Michael seemed pleased with my restraint. This is much more reasonable, he said, surveying our sparsely decorated living room. You used to go so overboard with all this holiday drama. This is better. Better. Our subdued, joyless holiday was better because it required less emotional investment from me and created no expectations for him. Emma opened her practical gifts with confusion, clearly missing the magic I used to infuse into Christmas morning. But expressing disappointment would have been dramatic, so I smiled and acted like this new version was an improvement. I stopped sharing good news from work because his responses ranged from disinterested to subtly competitive. When I received a promotion, I mentioned it the same way I'd mention picking up groceries. When a campaign I'd developed won an industry award, I didn't mention it at all. Celebrating achievements was dramatic. Pride in my work was excessive. Expecting enthusiasm from my spouse was unreasonable. Social situations became exercises in careful neutrality. I stopped expressing opinions that might lead to debate, stopped sharing funny stories that might seem attention-seeking, stopped engaging in conversations that might reveal too much personality. I became the quiet wife who smiled politely and let others carry conversations. Friends noticed the change. You seem different lately, Jennifer observed during one of our coffee dates. Quieter. Are you okay? How could I explain that I was performing okayness? That I'd trained myself out of spontaneous emotional expression because my husband found my authentic self inconvenient? That I was becoming a shadow of who I used to be because the alternative was constant criticism? I'm fine, I told her, which was true in the way that surviving is fine, even when you're not really living. The saddest part was how effective this strategy became. Michael grew more affectionate as I became less emotionally demanding. He complimented my maturity and told people how I'd grown out of my dramatic phase. Our fights decreased dramatically because I'd stopped bringing up issues that bothered me. On the surface, our marriage looked peaceful. Underneath, I was suffocating from emotional isolation while performing contentment for a man who preferred the shell of me to the substance of me. The morning after my bathroom revelation, I woke up different. Not angry, not sad, just resolved. Michael was already downstairs making coffee, scrolling through his phone at the kitchen table like every other morning. Emma was still asleep, which gave us about 30 minutes alone together. Morning, babe, he said without looking up. Sleep okay? Normally, I'd answer, maybe mention the strange dream I'd had or comment on how tired I felt. Today, I simply nodded and poured myself coffee. He didn't notice the lack of verbal response because he wasn't really listening anyway. The real test came that evening when he left his dinner dishes on the counter despite the dishwasher being right underneath them. Old Sarah would have said something, probably framed as a gentle request. Hey, could you put your plate in the dishwasher? New Sarah simply rinsed his plate and loaded it herself while he settled onto the couch with his laptop. 2 hours later, when I was folding the laundry I'd washed, dried, and sorted alone, he called from the living room. Sarah, have you seen my navy polo? I knew exactly where it was. In the basket of his clothes I was currently folding. I also knew he'd never once asked where any of my clothes were when he couldn't find them, never offered to help with laundry, never acknowledged the work involved in keeping his wardrobe clean and organized. Instead of responding verbally, I walked to the living room and placed the folded polo on the coffee table next to his laptop. He glanced up briefly, said thanks, and went back to whatever was consuming his attention on screen. The first week was surprisingly easy because Michael didn't notice the change. He was so accustomed to my emotional availability being background noise that its absence registered about as much as the dishwasher's hum stopping. His daily experience remained unchanged. His meals appeared. His clothes were clean. His home was comfortable. His wife was pleasant. What changed was that I stopped volunteering information about my inner world. When my friend Jennifer called to share wedding planning drama, I listened supportively but didn't recap the conversation for Michael later. When I had a particularly good day at work, I kept the satisfaction to myself. When I felt frustrated about something, I processed it internally or called my sister instead of bringing it to my husband. The second week, he made his first comment. "You've been really quiet lately," he observed over dinner. "Everything okay?" I smiled and nodded, then turned my attention to helping Emma with her math homework. He waited a moment for elaboration that didn't come, then shrugged and returned to his meal. By the third week, the pattern was established. Michael's requests were met with action rather than discussion. His attempts at conversation received minimal responses. His complaints about work got sympathetic nods instead of supportive commentary. His excitement about fantasy football was acknowledged but not engaged with. The beauty of this approach was its unassailability. I wasn't being hostile or passive-aggressive. I was simply contained, reserved. I responded to direct questions with yes or no answers. I fulfilled all my household responsibilities without complaint. I maintained pleasant demeanor and appropriate responses to Emma's needs. Michael couldn't call me dramatic because there was no drama. No tears, no raised voices, no emotional expressions to dismiss. I'd become exactly what he'd always claimed to want. A wife who didn't burden him with unnecessary feelings. "You seem really chill lately," he commented one evening as I prepared Emma's lunch for the next day. "I guess you finally learned to not stress about every little thing." I smiled and continued cutting apple slices. He interpreted my silence as agreement, as evidence that his years of calling me dramatic had successfully trained me into emotional equilibrium. He had no idea that my silence wasn't peace. It was strategy. The most telling moment came when his mother visited for the weekend. Previously, I would have shared my anxiety about these visits with Michael, seeking reassurance or at least acknowledgement that his mother could be difficult. This time, I simply prepared for her arrival without commentary. When she made her usual passive-aggressive comments about my housekeeping, my cooking, and my parenting, I responded with polite neutrality instead of defensive explanations. When Michael failed to support me in conversations where his mother criticized my choices, I felt the familiar hurt, but showed nothing. After she left, Michael was almost giddy. "That went so well. You handled my mom perfectly. No drama, no tension. See how much better things are when you don't overreact to everything?" Perfect. I'd been perfect by absorbing disrespect without response, by accepting criticism without defense, by making everyone comfortable at the expense of my own dignity. And he was proud of me for it. That night, as he fell asleep satisfied with my performance, I lay awake recognizing the profound shift in our dynamic. He thought he'd won by training me out of my emotional responses. But really, I'd won by withholding the very thing he'd taken for granted, my emotional investment in our relationship. The most unexpected aspect of my new approach wasn't how it affected Michael. It was how it affected me. Without the constant emotional labor of managing his responses to my feelings, I discovered I had enormous amounts of mental and emotional energy that had been going unnoticed. For 8 years, I'd been unconsciously calibrating every expression, every concern, every joy against his potential reaction. Would this upset him? Would he call me dramatic? Would he roll his eyes or sigh in that particular way that made me feel like a burden? That constant calculation had been exhausting in ways I'd never fully recognized. Now, freed from that self-censorship, I began redirecting my emotional energy inward. I started keeping a journal again, something I'd abandoned early in our marriage when Michael had commented that writing about feelings was kind of teenage girl dramatic. The pages filled quickly with thoughts and observations I'd been suppressing for years. I reconnected with parts of myself that had gone dormant. I'd always loved reading, but had gradually stopped because Michael would make comments about me always having my nose in a book when he wanted attention. Now I devoured novels during Emma's bedtime routine after she was asleep, on weekend mornings while Michael slept late. My friendships deepened in unexpected ways. Without the need to constantly defend or explain Michael's behavior, I could focus entirely on my friends' lives and concerns. Jennifer noticed immediately. "You seem so present lately," she said during one of our weekly coffee dates. "Like really here with me instead of distracted." She was right. I'd been distracted for years, always partially focused on managing the emotional temperature of my marriage. Now, with that burden removed, I could invest fully in relationships that actually nourished me. I discovered that I was funnier than I'd remembered. My sense of humor had been gradually suppressed because Michael often responded to my jokes with confusion or criticism rather than laughter. "That's kind of a weird thing to say," he'd comment, making me second-guess my comedic instincts. But with my coworkers, with Emma, with friends, I found myself making observations that genuinely entertained people. Emma benefited most from this change. Without the constant undercurrent of tension from trying to manage her father's emotional availability, I could be more present with her. We developed inside jokes, started having longer conversations about her day, began working on art projects together. She started seeking me out for comfort when she was upset, sensing perhaps that I had more emotional space to hold her feelings. The house ran more smoothly, paradoxically, because I stopped expecting Michael's help. Instead of the ongoing frustration of asking for assistance that might or might not materialize, I simply handled everything myself and found efficient systems. I meal prepped on Sundays, established streamlined cleaning routines, and created organizational systems that worked for me rather than hoping for partnership that consistently disappointed. Most significantly, I began observing my marriage from an almost anthropological perspective. Without emotional investment in changing Michael's behavior, I could see our patterns with startling clarity. I noticed how he only initiated conversations when he needed something from me. I observed how his moods dictated the household atmosphere. I recognized how he consistently positioned himself as the rational one by framing my needs as excessive. These observations weren't painful anymore because they weren't personal. They were simply data about a dynamic I was no longer actively participating in. It was like watching a play I'd once starred in, but was now viewing from the audience. I also began making practical preparations for an uncertain future. I opened a separate savings account and began automatically transferring money each paycheck. I researched local attorneys, not with immediate plans for divorce, but with the recognition that my marriage might not survive my transformation. I updated my resume and began networking more actively at work. These weren't vengeful actions or dramatic gestures. They were practical steps taken by a woman who was finally thinking clearly about her situation. Without the emotional fog of constantly trying to repair a relationship with someone who didn't value my efforts, I could see my circumstances objectively. The most profound change was in my relationship with myself. For years, I'd internalized Michael's narrative that my emotions were excessive, my needs were unreasonable, my responses were dramatic. In the silence, I rediscovered that my emotional intelligence was actually a strength. My capacity for empathy, my ability to read situations, my intuitive understanding of others' needs. These weren't character flaws to be managed, but gifts to be valued. I realized I'd been trying to dim my light to make Michael more comfortable, shrinking myself to fit his narrow definition of appropriate female emotion. In reclaiming my silence, I was also reclaiming my power to define my own emotional experience. 3 months into this new approach, I felt more like myself than I had in years. Not the self I'd been before marriage, but a stronger, wiser version who'd learned to protect her energy and value her own emotional well-being above others' comfort with her authenticity. By month 4, Michael's satisfaction with my improved behavior began shifting into something else. The change was subtle at first. Longer glances when I didn't respond to his commentary about the neighbors. Slight hesitation when I answered his questions with efficient brevity instead of elaborate explanations. He'd grown accustomed to a particular dynamic where his observations, complaints, and random thoughts were met with my engaged responses. Even when those responses frustrated him, they provided a form of emotional stimulation he'd taken for granted. Now his words fell into a void that apparently felt less satisfying than he'd expected. "The coffee tastes different today," he mentioned one morning, clearly fishing for conversation about coffee brands, preparation methods, or my grocery shopping choices. I responded, continuing to pack Emma's lunch. He waited for elaboration that didn't come. "Did you buy a different brand?" "Same brand," I replied without turning around. Another pause. "Maybe the machine needs cleaning." I nodded but didn't offer to clean it, discuss cleaning schedules, or engage with the implied criticism of my coffee maintenance. He stood there for another moment, seemingly expecting more, then left for work with an expression I couldn't quite read. These moments accumulated. Michael would make comments designed to elicit responses, complaints about work that used to generate sympathetic discussion, observations about household issues that previously sparked problem-solving conversations, opinions about current events that once led to lengthy debates. Each comment met with polite acknowledgement, but no engagement. The most telling incident occurred during a dinner party at our friends Kate and David's house. Previously, I would have participated actively in group conversations, sharing stories, asking follow-up questions, contributing to the social energy. That evening, I remained pleasant but reserved, speaking when directly addressed but not driving conversation. Michael tried several times to draw me into discussions. "Sarah has a funny story about her boss," he said during a lull in conversation. Everyone looked at me expectantly. "It's not that interesting," I replied with a smile, taking a sip of wine. He looked confused. This was a story I told him earlier that week, and he'd laughed at it. But I had no desire to perform for the group or provide entertainment on command. Kate smoothly redirected the conversation, but I caught Michael staring at me with an expression that was part confusion, part annoyance. On the drive home, he brought it up. "You were really quiet tonight. Everyone probably thinks you're mad at them or something." "I wasn't mad," I said truthfully. "Just tired. But you're always tired lately. And quiet. You used to be more, I don't know, social." I glanced at him, recognizing this as potentially the first time he'd expressed missing something about my personality. For years, he'd been trying to modify my social tendencies, calling me attention-seeking when I told stories, dramatic when I expressed strong opinions, exhausting when I engaged deeply with others' problems. "I thought you preferred me this way," I said simply. He was quiet for the rest of the drive, but I could sense wheels turning in his mind. The questioning increased. "Are you okay? You seem distant. Is something bothering you? You're not talking as much. Are you mad at me about something?" Each inquiry was met with gentle reassurance that I was fine, not mad, just focused on other things. Which was completely true. I was fine, better than I'd been in years. I wasn't mad. Anger required emotional investment I was no longer making, and I was focused on other things. My daughter, my work, my friendships, my personal growth. What Michael was detecting wasn't hostility or depression. It was absence. The absence of my emotional availability, my investment in his inner world, my effort to bridge the gap between us when he built walls. He began making more efforts to engage me, asking about my day with genuine curiosity instead of perfunctory politeness, volunteering information about his work without my prompting, making jokes that seemed designed to elicit laughter and conversation rather than just amusing himself. These attempts felt awkward because they were unprecedented. For years, our communication had been largely functional. Logistics about schedules, brief updates about Emma, his monologues about his interests while I listened supportively. Now he seemed to want something more, but neither of us knew how to create it. The most significant crack appeared during a Sunday afternoon when Emma was at a birthday party. Michael was watching football, and I was reading on the porch. He came outside and sat down next to me. "Want to talk?" he asked. I looked up from my book, surprised. "About what?" "I don't know. Anything. We don't really talk anymore." "We talk every day," I pointed out, which was factually accurate. "Not really talk. Like, have conversations. About real stuff." I considered this request. Real stuff. For 8 years, I'd tried to engage him in conversations about real stuff. My feelings, our relationship, my concerns, my dreams, my fears. All of it had been dismissed as drama. "What kind of real stuff?" I asked. He looked uncomfortable, as if he'd expected me to simply start talking and hadn't prepared for needing to be specific. "I don't know. How you're feeling about things. What you're thinking about." The irony was almost stunning. He was asking me to voluntarily provide the exact emotional access I'd been criticized for offering. "I'm feeling fine about things," I said truthfully, "and I'm thinking about this book mostly." He sat there for another minute, clearly wanting something he couldn't articulate, then went back inside. Month 6 brought a Michael I'd never seen before. The man who'd spent years training me out of emotional expression was now actively trying to provoke it. He'd become like a child poking a broken toy, increasingly frustrated that it wouldn't respond the way it used to. "Sarah, we need to talk," he announced one evening after Emma had gone to bed. He positioned himself on the coffee table directly in front of where I sat reading, making it impossible to ignore him. "Okay," I said, closing my book and giving him my attention. "Something's wrong. You're different. You don't talk to me anymore. You don't share things with me. You're like..." He struggled for words. "Like you're not really here." I waited for him to continue, genuinely curious about his perspective on what he'd been experiencing. "I miss you," he said finally, his voice smaller than usual. "I miss talking to you. I miss your stories about work. I miss hearing about your friends. I miss us." The confession was startling because it represented an admission that there had been an us worth missing, that my contributions to our relationship had value he'd failed to recognize while criticizing them. "What would you like me to share?" I asked, not combatively but genuinely seeking clarification. "I don't know." His frustration bubbled over. "Anything. Everything. You used to tell me about your day, about things that bothered you, about things that made you happy. Now you just exist. Exist." Yes, that was exactly what I'd been doing. Existing in his space without investing in his emotional experience. It was apparently less comfortable for him than he'd anticipated. "I thought you found those conversations dramatic. I said calmly. I never said that. I looked at him steadily. Michael, you've called me dramatic for expressing feelings about hundreds of situations over the years. You've rolled your eyes at my stories, sighed when I shared concerns, and told me I was overreacting to things that mattered to me. Why would I continue doing something that annoyed you? He was quiet for a long moment, clearly trying to process this logic. I didn't mean you should stop talking entirely. What did you mean? Another silence. Sometimes you got really worked up about things that didn't seem like a big deal. To you, I clarified. They didn't seem like a big deal to you. Right, to me. But that doesn't mean I wanted you to stop sharing things. This was fascinating. He was acknowledging that his perspective had been limited while simultaneously expecting me to continue offering my emotional world for his judgment. So you wanted me to keep sharing my feelings so you could decide which ones were valid? I asked. That's not... He stopped, realizing how that sounded. I don't know what I wanted, okay? But I know I don't want this. I don't want a wife who acts like a polite stranger. The word wife hung in the air. He was finally acknowledging that my role as his wife had involved emotional labor he'd taken for granted while criticizing its expression. I'm confused, Michael. For years, you've told me I was too emotional, too dramatic, too intense. I adjusted my behavior based on your feedback. Now you're saying you don't like the adjustment? His face reddened. You're being deliberately difficult. I'm being exactly what you trained me to be. That stopped him cold. The word trained clearly bothered him, probably because it implied a level of calculation he didn't want to acknowledge. Over the following weeks, his attempts to re-engage me became increasingly desperate. He'd ask direct questions about my feelings, then seem frustrated when I answered briefly instead of elaborating. He'd try to start arguments about household tasks, appearing almost relieved when I responded at all, even negatively. The most telling moment came when he actually tried to provoke what he'd previously called drama. I'd mentioned casually that my sister was going through a difficult time with her teenage daughter. Instead of his usual dismissive response, he pressed for details. What kind of difficult time? What's going on with Megan? I gave him the basic information without emotional commentary. Aren't you worried about it? He pushed. Of course. But you're not talking about it. You're not analyzing it or trying to solve it or getting upset about it. Would you like me to get upset about it? I don't know. Maybe. You used to care about things. I still care. I just don't perform my caring for your entertainment anymore. The word perform hit him like a slap. He stared at me as if seeing me clearly for the first time. Is that what you think you were doing? Performing? Weren't you always telling me I was being dramatic? Drama is performance, Michael. He left the room without another word, but I could see in his expression a dawning recognition of what he'd lost. Not a dramatic wife, but an emotionally engaged partner whose investment in their relationship he'd systematically discouraged until it disappeared entirely. By month 8, Michael's transformation was complete. The man who'd spent years dismissing my emotional expressions was now practically begging for them. He'd become everything he'd once accused me of being: dramatic, needy, attention-seeking, and exhausting. Please just tell me what you're thinking, he pleaded one morning as I prepared breakfast with my usual efficient silence. I can't stand this anymore. I looked at him with genuine curiosity. Can't stand what? This. You being so closed off, so distant. I feel like I'm living with a robot. A robot. Interesting choice of words from someone who'd systematically programmed me to suppress human responses. I'm not closed off, I replied, flipping Emma's pancakes. I'm exactly as open as you've indicated you want me to be. That's not true. Michael, last week you told Jennifer's husband that you'd finally trained me out of my dramatic tendencies. You said it was nice to have a wife who didn't make mountains out of molehills anymore. His face went pale. He'd clearly forgotten making that comment, probably because it had seemed like casual conversation to him, rather than a public declaration of his project to reshape my personality. The dinner parties became particularly uncomfortable for him. Where I'd once carried significant conversational weight in social situations, I now participated minimally. Other wives would share amusing anecdotes, express opinions about current events, or engage in friendly debates. I remained pleasant, but largely silent. Sarah's been really quiet lately, Kate mentioned to Michael during one gathering, her concern evident. Is everything okay? She's fine, Michael answered quickly, but I could see him watching me anxiously, probably hoping I'd jump in to demonstrate my social engagement. Instead, I smiled at Kate. I'm perfectly fine, just enjoying listening to everyone else's stories. Later, at home, Michael exploded. You made me look like an ass tonight. Everyone thinks something's wrong with our marriage. Is something wrong with our marriage? I asked calmly. The question stopped him short. He'd been operating under the assumption that our marriage was better than ever because I'd stopped creating drama. Now he was forced to confront whether a relationship with minimal emotional connection could actually be considered healthy. I don't know, he admitted finally. I don't know what's wrong, but something is. What would you like to be different? I want you to talk to me. I want you to share things with me. I want to know what you're thinking and feeling. Even if what I'm thinking and feeling seems dramatic to you, I don't care if it's dramatic. I studied his face, seeing genuine desperation there. You understand that this is exactly what I was doing for years? Sharing my thoughts and feelings? And your consistent response was to dismiss them as excessive? Maybe I was wrong, he said quietly. Maybe. After 8 years of marriage and months of living with the consequences of his emotional dismissiveness, he was willing to entertain the possibility that he'd been wrong. What changed your mind? I asked. He was quiet for a long time. I guess I didn't realize how much I depended on your energy, on your caring about things, on your emotional investment in everything. He paused. Our house feels dead now. You still do everything you've always done, but it's like you're not really here. I'm here, I said. I'm just not performing my presence for your benefit anymore. I don't want you to perform. I want you to just be yourself. This is myself, Michael. This is who I am when I'm not constantly trying to manage your reactions to my emotional expressions. He looked stricken. Is this permanent? Are you ever going to go back to how you were? The question revealed everything. He didn't want to rebuild our relationship on healthier foundations. He wanted me to return to providing the emotional energy he'd taken for granted, while accepting his criticism of how I provided it. I don't know, I answered honestly. I don't know if I can go back to investing emotional energy in someone who's likely to dismiss it as drama. I won't do that anymore. You said you were wrong about dismissing my feelings, but you haven't actually apologized for years of doing it. You haven't acknowledged how it felt to have my emotional world constantly invalidated. You're just upset that I've stopped providing something you apparently valued more than you realized. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, perhaps recognizing that any defense would prove my point. I want to fix this, he said finally. Fix what, exactly? Us. Our marriage. I want my wife back. Your wife is right here, I replied. You just don't like who she became after years of your feedback. The silence that followed was pregnant with the weight of recognition. He was finally understanding that he couldn't have it both ways. Couldn't criticize my emotional expression for years, then expect me to continue offering it unchanged. My silence had revealed the power dynamic he'd never acknowledged, that he'd been dependent on my emotional labor while simultaneously devaluing it. Without my investment, our relationship had become exactly what he'd claimed to want, drama-free and peaceful. The fact that he now found it unbearable said everything about what he'd actually lost. 12 months of strategic silence taught me more about my marriage than 8 years of trying to communicate had. It revealed that Michael's complaints about my drama were never about helping me develop emotional regulation. They were about controlling the terms of our relationship so that his comfort took precedence over my humanity. The woman who'd stood in that bathroom mirror a year ago, questioning whether her feelings were valid, had been replaced by someone who knew her worth without external validation. I discovered that my emotional intelligence wasn't a character flaw to be managed, but a strength to be valued. My capacity for deep feeling, meaningful connection, and intuitive understanding weren't excessive. They were gifts that deserved appreciation, not criticism. Michael's recent attempts at reconciliation felt hollow because they focused on what he was missing, rather than what he'd done wrong. He wanted me to return to my previous emotional availability without acknowledging the years of dismissal that had killed it. He was mourning the loss of my investment in our relationship while showing no understanding of why that investment had become unsustainable. During one of his latest attempts to engage me in real conversation, he asked what it would take for things to go back to normal. I realized then that normal had been the problem. Normal had been me shrinking myself to accommodate his discomfort with authentic emotion. Normal had been accepting crumbs of attention while providing full meals of support. Normal had been allowing someone else to define the validity of my inner experience. I don't want things to go back to normal, I told him. Normal wasn't working for me. The beautiful irony wasn't lost on me. The man who'd accused me of being dramatic had become the most dramatic person in our household. He was the one creating emotional scenes, demanding attention, expressing frustration when his needs weren't met. He'd become everything he'd criticized me for being, while I'd become everything he'd claimed to want: calm, contained, and undemanding. But his dissatisfaction with getting exactly what he'd asked for revealed the truth. He hadn't wanted a less emotional wife. He'd wanted a wife whose emotions were perfectly calibrated to serve his needs without inconveniencing him with her own. The silence that began as self-protection had evolved into self-respect. I'd learned to value my emotional energy enough to stop offering it to someone who didn't appreciate its worth. I'd discovered that withdrawing investment from a relationship that consistently devalued my contributions wasn't giving up, it was growing up. To every woman reading this who's been told she's too much, too emotional, too sensitive, too dramatic, too intense, I want you to know that the problem isn't your emotional capacity. The problem is being in relationship with people who are intimidated by emotional depth, uncomfortable with genuine human connection, or determined to maintain control through invalidation. Your feelings are not performance. Your needs are not excessive. Your desire for emotional intimacy is not drama. And your decision to protect your emotional energy from those who consistently devalue it isn't selfishness, it's wisdom. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop fighting for someone's attention and start paying attention to how they make you feel about yourself. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop loving someone who's proven they don't know how to receive love without diminishing it. My year of silence taught me that I don't need anyone's permission to feel my feelings fully. I don't need anyone's approval to value my emotional experience. And I don't need to convince anyone of my worth. I just need to stop accepting treatment that suggests I don't have any. If you're in a relationship where your emotional expressions are consistently labeled as excessive, where your feelings are regularly dismissed as invalid, where your attempts at connection are criticized as attention-seeking, I encourage you to ask yourself, what would happen if you stopped trying? What would happen if you withdrew your emotional investment and focused that energy on yourself instead? You might discover, as I did, that your silence speaks louder than your words ever did. You might find that removing your emotional labor from someone who doesn't value it reveals exactly what they've been taking for granted. And you might learn that the peace you've been seeking isn't found in getting someone else to validate your feelings. It's found in validating them yourself. The most dramatic thing I ever did was stop being dramatic. And in that stillness, I found my power.